So to start, I should probably give a little background on the memory consolidation system. There are three processes in the memory system: encoding or consolidation, storage, and retrieval. The consolidation process is the first process in the memory consolidation where new information is encoded for storage. These memories that are formed during consolidation are initially stored in the hippocampus. Then we continue on to the storage process where the brain retains that encoded information over time to hold the information until you need it, and then we continue to the retrieval process, which is the recovery of the stored information later on to get it out so that we are consciously aware of it. The hippocampus is involved in the retrieval process as well, which we can see in the example of patients with damage to their hippocampus, where they can retrieve memories from at least 2 or more years before they damage their hippocampus. The hippocampus isn't the only part of the brain used, though. One of the most interesting and studied cases that we talk about is with patient HM. So when HM was a teenager, he would get really bad seizures, and he wanted a way to make them stop. He went through an experimental operation where both of his temporal lobes were removed because that was where the seizure activity was. The surgery sort of worked. His seizures stopped, but he couldn't remember anything in his short-term memory anymore. This is called Anterograde Amnesia, which is when you have problems forming new memories. And he also had retrograde amnesia, where he couldn't remember things from before the impairment. He couldn't remember things from between when he was 16 and when he had the surgery. He had problems with consolidation or encoding the new memories, and also with the retrieval of old memories. And so this showed that the hippocampus, which is used in both of those processes, is actually not the permanent and final site for storing memories, since he did not have damage to his hippocampus. Anyways, back to your question about Alzheimer's. So before diving too deep into whether you have Alzheimer's, you should probably know what the difference between normal aging and Alzheimer's is. Normal aging, like some examples, is like when you forget what day it is but you remember it later, or when you start to lose things every once in a while. Aging causes deficits in the midbrain, the lower frontal lobes, and some prefrontal areas, and it can result in lesser volume in the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, which are super important for a person's ability to learn, their memory, and their cognitive function. So most people, when they start to worry about Alzheimer's and dementia, it's when they start to forget things, but forgetting things is actually pretty normal with aging. In order for a professional to diagnose you with Alzheimer's or dementia, your forgetfulness and other symptoms would have to be so bad that they are negatively impacting your daily life and not just some tiny inconveniences. There are some early warning signs you can look out for, though. One of the signs is like if it becomes difficult to do something that you would normally do on a daily basis, like if all of a sudden you can't balance your checkbook even though you do it all the time. Some other signs would be like if you get confused about the time, the place, or when you start having bad judgment making decisions. So you might be asking now then, what actually is Alzheimer's? It's basically a type of dementia where the progressive brain deterioration and impaired memory have decreased cognitive abilities, and there are many things that could cause Alzheimer's, one of those being heredity. Heredity is a pretty important factor in whether or not you end up with Alzheimer's, and there are 4 known genes that relate to the onset of Alzheimer's, called the amyloid precursor protein, presenilin-1, presenilin-2, and APOE4. I'm not sure if I'm saying those right, but there are most likely a bunch of other genes, but those are the only known ones that we can see right now. And actually, if you're worried about it, there are ways that you can be tested for Alzheimer's. So one of those ways that they might test you is using structural brain imaging, like an MRI or a CT scan. Using these techniques, they can figure out if it isn't Alzheimer's, and they can use it to rule out other potential problems. So it doesn't necessarily diagnose Alzheimer's, but they can use it to measure your levels of that beta amyloid that I talked about earlier. If you have high levels of it, then you might have dementia. Another way they can tell is if you have the apolipoprotein E gene. Like I said earlier, genetics is a huge part of whether or not you get Alzheimer's, so even though having this gene does not mean you will definitely have Alzheimer's, it really increases the risk for it. But whether you have Alzheimer's or not, there are some proactive ways that you can slow down that aging clock. Since there are a ton of ways to do this, I'm actually only going to talk about 2. And the first one is to take part in aerobic exercise. I know it seems like this generation's solution to everything to exercise, but it actually is proven to work. There is new research out of Assistant Professor Aga Brzezinski's brain lab at Colorado State University that shows that white matter, which connects and carries signals between different neurons, also changes for the better in response to some aerobic exercise. And this actually gives a boost to people's memory recall and lessen the signs of cognitive aging. Another way, though, is to avoid eating processed foods. Research have figured out that on top of the other physical health issues that an unhealthy processed diet can cause, it can also cause a decline in cognitive health. People who have either avoided eating processed foods or at least supplemented a diet that still has processed foods in it with DHA, which is an omega-3 fatty acid, it helped weaken memory problems, and it also reduced inflammation in the brain. So if you're worried about Alzheimer's, then I highly suggest you look more into these proactive preventative measures.